There is a clay tablet in the British Museum's cuneiform collection, part of a Babylonian text called the Erra Epic, pressed sometime around 1000 BCE. It describes 7 beings who existed before the flood. The Sumerians called them the Apkallu. They emerged from deep water, the tablet says, and taught humanity stone-cutting, temple design, and the reading of astronomical signs. The text is precise about what they did. It says nothing about where they worked. On a limestone hill in southeastern Turkey, the oldest monumental stone structures on Earth have been standing for 12,000 years. Their builders have no names in any record. The excavation began in 1994, when a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt visited a hill in southeastern Turkey called Göbekli Tepe, Potbelly Hill in Turkish, and recognized that the flint tools scattered across the surface were not the remnants of a medieval settlement. They were older, much older. Schmidt spent the next 2 decades uncovering what is now the oldest known monumental stone architecture on Earth. The numbers are not in dispute. Göbekli Tepe dates to approximately 9600 BCE, confirmed by radiocarbon analysis of organic material found within the enclosures. That makes it more than 11,000 years old, older than the wheel, older than writing, older than agriculture. The site contains at least 20 circular and oval enclosures, each anchored by pairs of T-shaped limestone pillars, standing up to 6 meters tall and weighing between 10 and 20 tons each. Their surfaces are carved in high relief: foxes, vultures, scorpions, aurochs, headless human figures. The iconographic vocabulary is precise and consistent. The site covers approximately 90,000 square meters. Less than 5% has been excavated. The official explanation for who built it has not changed in 30 years of scholarly publication. The builders were hunter-gatherers, pre-agricultural people with no permanent settlements, no written language, no metal tools, and no domesticated animals lived. The consensus holds, in small nomadic bands that ranged across the upper Mesopotamian plain. At some point around 9600 BCE, enough of them converged on a single limestone hill to quarry and raise precision-cut pillars into standing structures before farming had been invented anywhere on Earth. That explanation is not wrong. It is the best supported account available given the current evidence. It simply fails to answer the question it appears to answer. Quarrying a 20-ton limestone block requires specialized tools and the knowledge of how to use them. Transporting it up a hill requires organized labor on a scale that implies a directing authority, someone who can coordinate dozens of people across a sustained period. Raising it into a vertical standing position and fitting it to a pre-planned layout requires engineering knowledge that cannot be improvised at the moment of need. These are not romantic objections to the hunter-gatherer explanation. They are logistical ones. The kind of organization that built Göbekli Tepe is the organization of an institution capable of planning across generations, not a community that meets seasonally at a hill. The iconographic consistency reinforces this. The carved vocabulary at Göbekli Tepe, the specific animals, the specific postures, the specific configurations of symbols across different enclosures, does not vary randomly. It follows rules. Enclosures built centuries apart share the same grammar of images. Someone maintained that grammar across generations of construction. Maintained grammars require transmission. Transmission requires continuity. Continuity across 5 centuries of stone carving requires something more durable than a seasonal gathering. It requires a body of knowledge that outlasts any individual who carries it. Consider the math. A scribe pressing cuneiform tablets in the city of Uruk, around 3000 BCE, was as far from the builders of Göbekli Tepe as we are today from the scribes of Uruk. We have continuous written records from Uruk forward. Names, building inscriptions, legal codes, royal annals covering every century between Mesopotamia and the present. The builders of Göbekli Tepe left no writing, no inscriptions, no named dedication on any stone. The structures they raised are the oldest monumental architecture on Earth. We cannot attach a single human name to any of it. This is where the tablets become relevant. In the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, there is a 4-sided clay prism approximately 20 centimeters tall, known as the Weld-Blundell prism, inscribed with cuneiform text sometime around 1800 BCE. It is the most complete surviving copy of a document scholars call the Sumerian King List, a record of every ruler who governed the land of Sumer, organized in sequence from the time before the flood to the historical period. The list begins in a period before recorded memory, with kings whose reign lengths are measured in units called shahs, each shah representing approximately 3,600 years. Alulim of Eridu reigned 28,800 years. Alangar of Eridu reigned 36,000 years. 8 kings, the list records, ruled 5 cities before the flood. Their combined reigns total more than 240,000 years. Then a single line, the flood swept over. After the flood, the list resumes with shorter reigns. Still impossibly long by modern standards, but shorter. The structure is deliberate. Something existed before. Something ended. Something new began after. Here is what the king list does not include. It names the pre-flood kings. It names their cities. It records their succession and the sequence of their rule. It does not name a single architect, a single stonecutter, a single surveyor, or a single person responsible for any of the sacred structures those kings presumably used. The pre-flood rulers reigned for spans that no human being could occupy in a single lifetime. The list treats these numbers as fact, not legend. The scribes who maintained this document across centuries of copying treated the royal names as worth preserving. But the people who built for those rulers, the ones whose knowledge and labour sustained whatever monumental construction the pre-flood period required, were not considered worth recording. That is the first thing the king list tells us about the builders. The second is that nobody has explained why. That is not a gap in the record. The well-Blundell prism was copied deliberately, maintained deliberately, treated as foundational to political legitimacy across multiple Sumerian city-states. When a king needed to establish dynastic authority, he placed himself within the king list's sequence. The document was not an accident of survival. It was maintained because it mattered. Its silence about builders is therefore as deliberate as its inclusion of kings. Someone decided what the record would contain and what it would leave out. The builders were left out, the stones remember, the clay tablets almost do. The gap between them, 6,400 years between the last pillar raised at Göbekli Tepe and the first cuneiform mark pressed in Uruk, is not empty. Something moved through that silence. What arrived in the scribal record was a shape. Before the flood, builders of exceptional knowledge built sacred things. The names did not make it. The location did not make it. What the oldest monumental architecture on Earth left behind was the stone itself, and the stone has never said who placed it. The Erra Epic opens with a crisis. Marduk, the chief deity of Babylon, has abandoned his throne. He cannot maintain the sacred order of his divine residence without the craftsmen who built and understood it. The text identifies them, the Apkallu, 7 of them, who existed before the flood, who established the designs of sacred structures, who possessed technical knowledge that Marduk describes as irreplaceable. Without them, he says, he cannot act. The craftsmen who knew how to build the things that mattered are no longer available. Not dead, the text specifies, but gone. They went back. The vocabulary the Erra Epic uses for what the Apkallu did is precise. Establishing designs in early Mesopotamian textual convention refers to architectural planning, the laying out of proportions, the specification of forms, the transmission of standardized measurements across generations of builders. Not ritual, not ceremony, technical knowledge of sacred construction, and the text is explicit that this knowledge was pre-flood knowledge. Whatever the Apkallu built, they built it before the flood swept over. After the flood, they returned to the Apsu, the deep underground freshwater realm, and the knowledge went with them. Here is the detail the tablets don't explain, where they worked. A second Babylonian text offers a partial answer that raises a deeper question. The Adapa myth, surviving in fragments held by both the British Museum and the Egyptian Museum in Berlin, describes the first Apkallu, Adapa himself, as one who perfected the designs of heaven and earth. Perfecting designs is not a metaphorical phrase in early Mesopotamian writing. It describes a technical act, measurement, survey, the encoding of proportions into forms that can be replicated across time and distance. Adapa received this knowledge directly from Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, the deity associated specifically with craft knowledge and the foundations of civilization. He did not develop it through ordinary human experience. It was given to him from a source that preceded the systems the tablets themselves describe. The Erra Epic says the Apkallu returned to the Apsu, the deep underground freshwater realm, after the flood. The text does not say they died. It says they went back down. Whatever they knew went with them, a separate tradition, preserved among the Dead Sea Scrolls and attributed to the Hebrew patriarch Enoch, describes 200 beings called the Watchers who descended to earth before the Great Flood. The Book of Enoch, chapters 6 through 8, lists their skills: the working of metals, the cutting of stone, the reading of astronomical signs, the construction of permanent structures. This is not general knowledge, it is the specific technical vocabulary of monumental stone construction. The Book of Enoch is not a Sumerian document. It was composed in a different language, preserved by different scribes, in a different region, within a completely separate textual tradition. It describes the same pre-flood event as the Erra Epic, builders with technical knowledge who existed before the flood and are subsequently removed from the accessible record. The mechanism of removal differs between traditions but produces the same result. The Apkallu returned to the Apsu. The Watchers, named in full in chapters 6 and 7 of Enoch, were declared non-canonical by the church councils of the 4th century CE. Their names were preserved in the text but stripped from the authoritative tradition. They exist in the document. They were not carried forward into the mainstream record that the Western tradition would inherit. In both cases, the pre-flood builders are present in the source text and absent from the living tradition. Here is what makes this more than coincidence. 3 independent traditions, the Sumerian King List, the Erra Epic, and the Book of Enoch, agree on the following. Before the flood, beings of exceptional technical knowledge built sacred structures for ruling powers whose names are preserved while the builders' names are not. After the flood, those beings departed by whatever mechanism the tradition specified, and subsequent civilizations were left with the memory of what had been done but not the capacity to replicate it. 3 traditions, 3 independent lines of transmission, separated by language, geography, and centuries of scribal development. 1 consistent description. What did they build? Where did they build it? Who maintained the symbolic vocabulary that required centuries of institutional memory to sustain? Who organized the labor, and why did every tradition agree to describe the organizers as gone? The tablets have the answers: the Apkallu, the Watchers, the unnamed craftsmen of Marduk's residence, but they refuse to attach those answers to a place. And there is, sitting in the limestone hills of southeastern Turkey, the oldest monumental stone architecture on Earth. Precisely cut pillars, a consistent iconographic vocabulary maintained across centuries of construction, a site spanning 1,500 years of continuous building. The tablets describe pre-flood builders with exactly the technical skills required to produce what Göbekli Tepe represents. The tablets will not say where those builders worked. The stones at Göbekli Tepe will not say who placed them. Both bodies of evidence are pointing at the same moment. They do not touch. That gap, between what the tablets remember and what the archaeology has now found, is not a small discrepancy in an otherwise coherent record. It is 6,400 years wide. It runs directly through the period when the world's oldest stone temples were built, used, and sealed underground. And it is precisely the gap that every tradition treats as if it does not require explanation. Here is the timeline the way it reads when you lay it out in sequence. Around 9,600 BCE, construction begins at Göbekli Tepe. The work continues for approximately 1,500 years. Around 8,000 BCE, the site is deliberately sealed. The enclosures filled with clean imported material, the pillars buried, the location erased from the surface of the hill. Around 3,200 BCE, the first Sumerian writing appears in the city of Uruk. Around 2100 BCE, the oral traditions of Sumerian kingship are committed to clay, producing the earliest versions of the King List, which reaches back to a pre-flood epoch but names no builders. Around 1800 BCE, the weld blundell prism is pressed, preserving the most complete surviving copy of the King List. Around 1000 BCE, the Erra Epic is composed, naming the Apkallu as pre-flood builders whose knowledge was lost at the flood. Sometime between 300 and 200 BCE, the Book of Enoch is composed, independently describing pre-flood builders with the identical technical skill set. In the 4th century CE, the Book of Enoch is ruled non-canonical. In 1994, Klaus Schmidt begins excavating a hill in southeastern Turkey and finds limestone pillars that have been sealed underground for nearly 10,000 years. 9 dates, 1 trajectory. Something was built before the flood traditions begin. The traditions remember the builders, but not the location. The location is found 11,000 years later, with the builders' names absent from every document ever pressed. Not coincidence, pattern. The burial is the clearest physical evidence of the pattern. The German Archaeological Institute's excavation teams have documented the fill composition across multiple enclosures at Göbekli Tepe. The material is not random debris accumulated over time. It is clean, sorted stone, worked flint, soil without organic waste, carried in deliberately from locations outside the enclosures. There is no waste layer, no domestic refuse, no gradual silting that would suggest the site was simply abandoned. The labour required to fill the enclosures was comparable to the labour required to build them. Whoever sealed Göbekli Tepe organised the effort with the same institutional capacity that raised the pillars. A site buried with that deliberation is a site someone decided should not be found. The astronomical orientation of the enclosures adds a dimension that the burial evidence alone cannot explain. Göbekli Tepe's main enclosures, designated enclosures A, B, C and D by the excavation team, are oriented so that the gap between their central T-pillar pairs aligns with the rising position of Orion's belt as it appeared on the southeastern horizon around 9600 BCE. That alignment requires knowledge of stellar precession, the slow drift of star positions caused by the wobble in the Earth's rotational axis, which shifts the apparent position of constellations over thousands of years. To orient a structure toward where Orion rose in 9600 BCE, you must know where Orion rose in 9600 BCE. That is not instinctive knowledge, it is calculated knowledge, accumulated and transmitted across enough generations of systematic sky observation to establish a reliable baseline. Hunter-gatherer bands meeting seasonally without institutional continuity do not build multi-generational astronomical records. Something else did. The carved vocabulary reinforces what the orientation implies. The T-pillars at Göbekli Tepe, that distinctive widened anthropomorphic form, follow the same proportional template across enclosures spanning at least 5 centuries of construction. The animals carved in high relief obey a consistent iconographic grammar. Foxes in specific postures, vultures associated with headless human figures, scorpions positioned near the base of central pillars. This symbolic vocabulary did not drift over 500 years of active use. Someone maintained it. The maintenance of a symbolic vocabulary across generations requires institutional transmission, and institutional transmission requires continuity that exceeds any individual's lifetime. The builders of Göbekli Tepe had that institution. What they did not leave behind was a name for it. Here is what I keep coming back to. There had to have been, at some point after the burial, perhaps a century after, perhaps 5 centuries, a person who still knew why the hill mattered, who had been told by someone who had been told by someone else that beneath that particular arrangement of hills lay something important. That person carried the memory through the agricultural transition, through the first river settlements, through the emergence of the first cities along the Tigris and Euphrates. They told someone, that someone told someone. By the time Sumerian scribes were pressing king lists into clay, the memory had travelled through dozens of generations of transmission. It arrived stripped of its location, stripped of the names of the people who built what was being half-remembered. What survived was the outline. Before the flood, builders of extraordinary knowledge built sacred things. Then the flood came, then they were gone. 3 independent traditions preserved that outline. The Sumerian scribes called the builders the Apkallu and said they returned to the deep water. The Hebrew scribes preserved the watchers and then had that text removed from canonical memory. The Sumerian King List preserved the pre-flood rulers and omitted the people who built for them. And under a hill in southeastern Turkey, the structures themselves sat in the dark, precisely cut, astronomically aligned, covered in symbols no living person could read, waiting for an excavation that would not begin for 11,000 years. The tablets and the stones are describing the same moment in human history. They have been describing the same moment for thousands of years. The connection is not subtle once you see it. The builders described in the tablets possessed the skills that Göbekli Tepe required. Göbekli Tepe was built in the period the tablets describe. The names that should bridge those 2 facts are absent from both. The missing names are not distributed randomly across the historical record. They are specifically absent from the moment of transition, from the period between the last stone raised at Göbekli Tepe and the first mark pressed in Uruk. Every tradition that touches that period produces the same result: a description of the builders, a mechanism for their departure, and silence where the location and the names should be. Göbekli Tepe, sealed under sorted stone for 10,000 years, is the silence made physical. The stones are still there. The questions the scribes declined to answer are still open. Less than 5% of the site has been touched. The clay tablet in the British Museum's collection, part of the Erra Epic, pressed in cuneiform around 1000 BCE, is still readable. The text survived 3,000 years of burial at Nineveh, survived excavation, survived the cataloguing process of a 19th century imperial museum. What it says is the same as what it has always said. The Apkallu existed before the flood. They built sacred things, they returned to the deep water, and the location of what they built was not recorded. That absence of location runs through every layer of the textual tradition in the same direction. The Sumerian King List names pre-flood rulers, but gives no coordinates for their cities. The Genesis, one of the oldest Sumerian creation texts, describes the gods bestowing upon humanity the arts of civilization, city building, temple maintenance, astronomical observation, without specifying where those arts were first practiced. It presents the origin of civilization as a known fact, already established, requiring no further elaboration. The knowledge of where was apparently so settled that no scribe thought to write it down, and no other Sumerian document has ever provided what the Genesis assumes its audience already knows. That is a particular kind of silence, the silence of a text that treats the question as answered and moves on. The Assyrian palace reliefs from the 7th and 8th centuries BCE, carved into the limestone walls at Nimrud, Nineveh, and Khorsabad, show the Apkallu in their most persistent iconographic form. Fish-cloaked figures, the head of a large fish worn over a human body, carrying in one hand a ritual bucket and in the other a cone-shaped purification object. In many panels, these figures stand before representations of structures, schematic plans, architectural outlines. They are positioned as teachers or presenters of sacred construction. Their iconographic tradition survived more than 2,000 years after the Erra Epic was first pressed. Their names survived in the academic literature on Mesopotamian religion. The location of what they built did not survive in either. Between the Assyrian wall carvings and the T-pillars under the limestone hill in southeastern Turkey lies something that cannot be demonstrated but also cannot be dismissed. It is the outline of a transmission. The builders of Göbekli Tepe sealed their site around 8000 BCE. Someone organized that sealing, knew what was being covered, made the decision to cover it, carried out the work. That person, or the tradition they sustained, carried knowledge of the site forward into the agricultural period, into the first permanent settlements, into the proto-urban communities that preceded the first Mesopotamian cities. The memory travelled. By the time it entered the scribal record, the specific address had been separated from the general memory. What the scribes received was a category, not a location. Before the flood, builders existed who knew how to build sacred things. The tablets preserved the category. The address was already gone. The Epic of Gilgamesh, preserved on 12 clay tablets in the British Museum's collection, contains in its 11th tablet the most detailed surviving Sumerian flood account. The survivor, Utnapishtim, is granted immortality by the gods after building a vessel to outlast the deluge. The text is precise about what was preserved across the flood: living creatures, the memory of the survivor, the divine favour that allowed reconstruction to begin again. What it does not contain is any reference to the location of what was built before the flood, to the plans of the structures that preceded the waters, or to the names of the people who raised them. The craft knowledge described in the Apkallu tradition, the specific skills for building and maintaining sacred structures, is absent from Utnapishtim's survival inventory. The Erra Epic explains why. The craftsmen went back into the deep water. They did not wait to pass their knowledge on. It was withdrawn. That withdrawal, documented in 3 independent traditions, each arriving at the same gap from a different direction, is not what the absence of evidence usually looks like. Incomplete records produce random gaps. A document survives or it doesn't. A fire destroys an archive or it doesn't. What produces a systematic gap, the same absence in the same direction across documents that share no scribal lineage, is a decision. Someone decided what the traditions would carry forward. Location was not on the list. The archive of what survived is not small. The Sumerian King List exists in multiple copies, pressed by different scribal schools in different cities, across more than 500 years of Mesopotamian history. The Erra Epic survives in several tablet copies. The Adapa myth survives in fragments from multiple locations. The Book of Enoch survived in Geer's translation among the Ethiopian Orthodox canon after its removal from the Western tradition. What survived is extensive. What is systematically absent from all of it is the location of the oldest sacred construction on Earth. The documents were not incomplete. They were selective. They selected in the same direction. Here is the detail that still has no answer from the existing record. Göbekli Tepe covers approximately 90,000 square meters. Less than 5% has been excavated since Schmidt's team began work in 1994. The excavation has proceeded season by season, and each season extends the site's known complexity in ways the previous season did not anticipate. There are enclosures that have not been opened. There are sections of the fill that have not been reached. There are layers below the excavated layers that remain untouched. Somewhere under that hill, it is possible that a dedicatory inscription exists. A carved name, an attributed structure, a tablet pressed before the burial that describes what was being sealed and who had built it. It is also possible that the same deliberation that organised the burial organised a thorough removal of anything that could identify its authors. A sealing operation executed with the precision and institutional capacity that Göbekli Tepe's burial required was executed by people who knew exactly what they were doing and why. The tablets survive, the stones survive, the iconography survives. In Babylonian texts, in Assyrian wall carvings, in the consistent symbolic grammar maintained across 5 centuries of stone carving at a single hill in southeastern Turkey. What does not survive, in any form, from any tradition, is a single name attached to the act of building, not a patron, not a designer, not a quarry foreman, not a surveyor. The oldest monumental architecture on Earth has no author in any document that exists. The enclosures at Göbekli Tepe are still there. The T-pillars are standing inside the fill, waiting for the excavation team to reach them season by season. The astronomical alignments are still calculable, the angles are in the stone, and stone does not drift. The symbolic grammar is still readable to anyone trained in the iconographic conventions of the pre-pottery Neolithic. What is not readable is the authorship. The structures were preserved precisely because they were sealed. The people who sealed them built something capable of lasting indefinitely, and then protected it from the surface world for reasons that no surviving document records. The tablets in the British Museum's cuneiform collection, in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, in the Archaic Museum in Baghdad, everything that survived of Mesopotamian textual memory about the period before the flood has been translated, analysed and published. The Apkallu appear across multiple documents. Their functions are described in detail. Their post-flood departure is documented. Their connection to sacred construction is documented. The location of that construction is not documented in any of these texts, and none of these texts explains the omission. The stones at Göbekli Tepe remember. The tablets almost do. And somewhere in the 95% of that hill that no excavation team has yet opened, the distance between almost and exactly may still be lying in the dark, precisely cut, astronomically aligned, covered in symbols whose grammar has never been fully decoded, waiting for the question the scribes decided not to answer, to be asked again by someone with a trowel, enough time, and the willingness to read what the last witnesses actually left instead of what we have been told they should have recorded.